Psalm number 106. Could you give me just a little more volume, Amanda? Thank you. We want to focus in verses 6 down through verse number 10, but we'll just go ahead and start at verse number 1. Praise ye the Lord. O give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Who can utter the mighty acts of the Lord, and who can show forth all his praise? Blessed are they that keep judgment, and he that doeth righteousness at all times. Remember me, O Lord, with the favor that thou bearest unto thy people. Now, think about this request as we read it. The favor that thou bearest unto thy people. O visit me with thy salvation. Now remember, especially in the Old Testament, salvation had to do with deliverance from a present enemy. But now to us it's broader, because when we see and hear the word salvation, we think of the forgiveness of sin, the extinguishing of our guilt, and having a right relationship with God, and deliverance. But we want to enjoy the deliverance of God. And notice that deliverance is connected to his visitation. He comes and he gives deliverance. And then he adds, that I may see the good of thy chosen. God has a favor unto his people. And he mentioned it already in verse 4, the favor that thou bearest unto thy people. Now he calls it the good of thy chosen, that I may rejoice in the gladness of thy nation. Now, of course, here the nation of Israel is in focus, but in the New Testament, at this period that we're in right now, the church, which is made up of all nations, we're in a church gladness. Aren't you glad to be born again? Aren't you glad to be part of the church? And I was noticing, I had some time before church this evening, and I was looking at a documentary about a group of believers. And as they were showing different pictures, you could see people from different lands. And isn't that good? Isn't that a blessing to know that our family is international? And so there is the gladness of God's people. And then he says that I may glory in thine inheritance. Now, Israel has an earthly inheritance, but we have a heavenly inheritance in Christ Jesus. And we saw on Sunday night that we're heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. Our inheritance is great. But then he wakes us up and he says at verse 6, we have sinned with our fathers. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedly. Now, what could be so hideous all of a sudden as we were coming down through there? And it may amaze you. Our fathers understood not thy wonders in Egypt. Now, a lot of times we just simply say, well, we don't always understand what God's doing. And did you know sometimes that's a very bad thing, that we don't understand what God's doing? We need to be people of prayer and discernment so we can see and understand what God's doing. And he gives us specific examples. He refers to the wonders in Egypt, and we'll look at those in a moment. And then specifically, he said, they remember not the multitude of thy mercies. God is very merciful to us. So merciful that he sets it in the plural, mercies. We understood not thy mercies, and then again specifically, but provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. Nevertheless, he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make his mighty power to be known. He rebuked the Red Sea also, and it was dried up. So he led them through the depths as through the wilderness. And he saved them from the hand of him that hated them, and redeemed them from the hand of the enemies. Let's read on a couple of verses. Verse 11. The waters covered their enemies, there was not one of them left. Then believed they his words, and they sang his praise. Now, just to remind us, then he goes right ahead and says, then soon they forget his works. Prone to wander, prone to forget, that's us. Now, part of that has to do with we don't rehearse those things. We don't talk about them. We don't remind ourselves. Just like we sang first of all tonight, tell me the story of Jesus. We need to hear it again. And then we need to hear it again. And then we need to regularly visit in our heart and in our mind and memory when we were visited by him, and how he was merciful to us, and it will keep his wonders, his favor, his grace fresh in our minds. But now as we think about his wonders, and we'll not go back and read each of these verses because I do plan to read a couple of passages in Exodus, but I'd like to refer first of all to the plagues. And I'll give you the reference as I refer to the plagues. Do you remember when God first sent Moses and Aaron in to see Pharaoh? They said to Pharaoh, the Lord has said, let my people go that they may serve me. Now this was Pharaoh's reaction in Exodus 5 and verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and to let Israel go? Now, God never backs down from a challenge. God doesn't always react right when we think maybe he should, but he will answer a challenge. And so the challenge, the question is, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Well, God's getting ready to show Pharaoh and all Egypt who he is. And he's also getting ready to show the children of Israel who he is. Now keep in mind, here's a people that have been in bondage for some 400 years. Now they went down to sojourn. They went down to go through a time of famine and then go back home. Well, that extended. It was going real well. And then all of a sudden there was a Pharaoh that came to the throne that didn't know Joseph. And that Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph looked around and said, you know, pretty soon they're going to outnumber us. Best thing we can do is just make slaves out of all of them. And it didn't go so well. And they began to cry for mercy. They began to cry for deliverance. But you know, deliverance is one thing, but deliverance unto righteousness and holiness is a different matter altogether. Now think about that for a moment. Some people want to just get saved enough to stay out of hell, but they're not really interested in getting saved enough to become righteous and holy and obedient. And we need to think about that whole spectrum. As a matter of fact, he gives us parables to describe that. He said we should sit down first and think about the cost. And he gives an example of building a tower and such as that. What he's really talking about is the cost of discipleship. But here, Mr. Wilmington, Harold Wilmington, in his book, The Guide to the Bible, he gives these illustrations and these observations. The purpose was apparently twofold: to demonstrate to Israel the strength of their God. And sometimes I fail to realize who our God is and how powerful He is. Think about that. Secondly, to show the Egyptians. Now think about that. Some of the Egyptians were moved by what they saw. They were moved by what they heard. When the children of Israel left in the Exodus, there was a mixed multitude that followed them. Now, some of them were troublesome, but now those that hear truth many times will go ahead and react to it. And that's why it's important for us to tell the truth. But as we consider this and the plagues, 10 plagues, these 10 plagues were aimed specifically at the gods of Egypt. Now, when God hears and when God is pressed, He goes right to the heart of the matter. Who is the Lord? Well, He's going to show them, first of all, who is not the Lord. And so the first plague, water turned to blood, was an attack on Osiris, the god of the Nile. And that plague is in Exodus 7 and verse 20. Now, keep in mind that in idolatry, usually there are many gods. Not just one, but many. And so, secondly, then, the plague of frogs. And if I pronounce these names correctly, Hecht, the frog goddess. And so, God said, okay, y'all trust in a frog goddess? How about I just carpet the land with frogs? Could you imagine that? That slime, this for days under your feet, everywhere in everything, frogs. And there they were, a plague of frogs. That's Exodus 8 and verse 6. Lice. And this is against the god Seb, who was their earth god. And lice everywhere. Frogs, bloody water, lice, and that's in Exodus 8 and verse 17. And then the fourth one is flies. And flies was against Hetkach, Osiris' wife. And that's Exodus 8 and verse 24. And some of the translators actually believe it may have been more than just flies, but flying insects. So can you imagine that? All these flying insects, but in particular flies. And then the fifth one is cattle disease. Now this one was a biggie. It was against Apis, the sacred bull god. Exodus 9 and verse 6 is where the plague is listed. And Linda and I, we've been reading through Hosea. And as you come down to the last two chapters, God especially talks about them and their attachment to the calf, C-A-L-F, because many times the pagan images would have to do with a bull or an ox or a calf. You remember when Moses was gone up to get the law? Do you remember what Aaron formed for the people? A golden what? A calf. A tragedy, isn't it? You see, when the children of Israel were down in Egypt, they learned a lot of the ways of Egypt. And so the Lord sent a plague of cattle disease, and that's in Exodus 9 and verse 6. And then sore boils. And this was a loathsome boil. A runny sore, if you please. It was a very troublesome thing. And this was against Typhon, and that's Exodus 9 and verse 10. Then hail mixed with fire was against their god Shu, S-H-U, the god of the atmosphere, Exodus 9 and verse 24. Then number 8 was locust, and their god Serapia, the god who specifically protected them against locusts. Now think about this. I'll give you a couple of numbers, and these are also from Wilmington's Guide from the Bible. Within a square mile during an attack of locusts, it's possible that there could be 200 million of them. And you remember when they come in, they eat vegetation. And within, at that ratio, in 400 square miles, there could have been as many as 80 billion. And their God was helpless. Primarily why their God was helpless? Because He is not. There is no such a God, just specifically against locusts. And then we find number 9, the plague of darkness. And that plague of darkness was especially turned at Ra, their sun god. He was helpless to bring light in that darkness. And you remember how that darkness was described? It was like a mist that you could feel against your skin. A darkness all over the land except in one little portion called Goshen, where the children of Israel lived, and it was light there. Everywhere else was darkness. Now I mentioned, back up just a little bit to number 5, the cattle disease. Some of the Egyptians put their cattle up during that plague. You know why? They trusted what they were hearing. So they knew if they could get their cattle in, they would be safe from the plagues that were coming down. And then not only darkness, but then number 10, the death of the firstborn. And the death of the firstborn was Samaria, and it was turned against all the gods, like one more strike. None of your gods is able to stop the death angel coming through the land. They'll come for the firstborn. And God warned the children of Israel, said, at your house also. And you remember He gave them specific instructions what to do to protect themselves. They were to sacrifice a Passover lamb. They were to take the blood and put it on the doorpost and lintel. They were to roast that lamb, and they were to go inside their house, and they were supposed to eat it and stay inside the house. And you remember the grace, the picture, the grace of God said that if the house is too small for the lamb, then the lamb can cover the house next door. And you remember God's lamb, the Bible said, shed His blood. He came and died for the sins of the world. So His blood takes care of the sin of all nations. And all who will believe can become beneficiary to that blood. But all the gods of Egypt were helpless to stop the death of the firstborn. And that's Exodus 12 and verse 29. And so God said specifically, they sinned because they didn't understand the wonders. They couldn't understand that God specifically, He didn't just bring a challenge against the gods of Egypt. He destroyed the gods of Egypt. The concept of a false god, He laid it dead to the ground. And in other Psalms, He writes and tells us through the psalmist that there really are no other gods. He said, I am the Lord. Besides me, there is none else, Isaiah writes. And the psalmist goes on to say that the idols are nothing more than wood or stone. They have eyes, but they can't see. They have ears, but they can't hear. They have a mouth, but they can't speak through their throat. And by the time Paul, for example, he got a hold of that truth so profoundly that he didn't mind to go down to the shambles there in Corinth and buy meat that had been offered to the idols. He said, there's nothing there. There's nothing that can receive veneration from this. Said, I'll eat it. He said, but now if a weaker brother's offended by it, don't you eat it. And if you go to visit somebody and you suspect they might have bought it down at the shambles where they sell the idol meat, said, don't ask any questions. Said, just eat it, because it can't harm you, because they're not there. They're not real. But now the power behind them was demonic. He warned us about that also. He said you can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. That's the power behind idolatry. Now, remember that when Moses went in, the first wonder, you remember what it was? Now, I mentioned the plagues. You remember the first wonder they showed Pharaoh? Moses laid down his rod, and what happened? Jannes and Jambres, the magicians, they looked at each other and kind of shrugged their shoulders and laid theirs down, and those became serpents. Now, how'd that happen? Demonic power. But then Moses took his, and it gobbled theirs up. And then they could mimic so far, but then they couldn't go any farther. God used those wonders to show Israel his power, but also to show the Egyptians his power, and that their gods were not real. They were powerless. And then he specifically, concerning Israel, turns to the example of the Red Sea in verse number 7. He said, they remembered not the multitude of thy mercies, but provoked him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. Now, I would encourage you to turn with me. Hold your place, mark your place at Psalm 106, and we'll volley back and forth for a moment. But look at Exodus chapter number 14. Exodus 14. And the children of Israel are on their way now. They've left. Pharaoh finally, after the death of the firstborn, he's ready for them to get out. And then all of a sudden, here in verses 1 through 8, because of his hardness of heart, he realizes his slave workforce just left. And so he starts rounding up the chariots and the army. He's going to go after them. And verse 9 says, but the Egyptians pursued after them all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them encamping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth before Baal-zephon. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid, and the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. Now, get this picture. Here they are with the Red Sea in front of them, and Pharaoh coming up behind them. And then they're getting ready to dishonor God. And they're going to dishonor him by unbelief. They don't feel like their God's strong enough to deliver them. Now think about that. Now it's a challenge. The Red Sea in front of you. A full army coming from behind. But did you know there's an angel of the Lord in between? We'll read about it in a moment. But notice at verse 11 and 12. Now it says they cried out unto the Lord and said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, hast thou taken us away to die in the wilderness? Wherefore, why hast thou dealt thus with us to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone? Did you get that? That's what they told Moses. Just let us alone. It's not really that bad here. Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. Now, Psalm 106 says that in doing this, they provoked God. Now, remember we saw the other week, anger is an emotion. God says, be angry and sin not. They provoked God. More than once throughout this experience, they're going to provoke God. And so, let me tell you, and then I'll tell you again. You remember why God did what He did, don't you? He did it for His name's sake. He's already showed up Egypt's gods. He's delivering His people, and He's brought them to this place thus far. He's not planning on stopping at the Red Sea. He's not planning on stopping in the wilderness. God's goal is to deliver them into Canaan. Now, the reason they wandered 40 years was their fault. They could have been there shortly. But now here they are. Look at verse 13. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation. Now again, remember this idea of salvation in this context is deliverance. Watch God deliver you. See the salvation of the Lord, which He will show to you today. For the Egyptians, now envision this. They're looking at Pharaoh coming to them. The horsemen, the chariots, the footmen, they're all coming towards them. Listen what he says. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. They're never going to see or hear from Pharaoh again. None of his soldiers that are coming. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Then he goes on and he talks about in verse 17, he's going to harden the Egyptians' hearts. And God puts a protection between them. And He's got a pillar between them. The angel of God, verse 19, the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed. In other words, the angel of God was in front of them, but in this situation now, he moves and moves from in front of them and comes to the back. And that puts him between the Egyptians and themselves. And this angel of God brings a pillar and sets it before them. It's a pillar of light and fire to the children of Israel to warm them and to comfort them. But to the Egyptians, it's a pillar of darkness. So God's brought a separation. You can see it right here. Verse 20, and it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud of darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these, so that one came not near the other all the night. Now, Moses was to lift up the rod, and when he did, God caused an east wind to blow all night. And that east wind pushed the waters up till they became like a wall on each side. And as that wind continued to blow all night, it dried the ground. And so the children of Israel began to move through it when God said to move. Now keep in mind, they're not understanding this. They're not getting the picture. God is by miracle and power delivering them. He is literally redeeming them. Now I mentioned on, I guess it was Sunday night, redemption has two aspects to it. There's redemption by paying a price, and the price of our redemption was the blood of Christ. But then there's the action attached to redemption, which by miraculous power, God delivers those He's purchased. And He says He purchased Israel. He bought them. And now He is in the process of, by power, delivering them. Now keep in mind that He said in verses 17 and 18 that the Egyptians hardened their hearts. And verse 18, the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen. God said, I'm getting ready to shine forth on them. But it's not going to be in blessing. It's going to be in judgment. So they're wicked. They're brazen. They dare to go against God, even though they realize God has set a barrier between them and the Israelites. They're going to press forward. And so, verse 24, and it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. And you can read on, you know what He did? He loosened the chariot wheels. He unscrewed their lug nuts, if you will. And the wheels started falling off, and then they got the picture. But you know where they were when they got the picture? Deep into the Red Sea. They said that the Lord fighteth, this is the end of verse 25, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. They are beginning to get the picture. The Egyptians are getting the picture. The Lord is fighting for His people. They have a God that's real, and He's doing what He said He would do. And you know what? They can't get away. And you know what God does? He told Moses, He said, bring the rod again across the waters of the sea. And it says the waters returned to their strength. In other words, they filled up the seabed again. And Pharaoh and his army was there. And the children of Israel could see them. Consumed. Isn't that amazing? Now, let me interject here. Do we realize that when God redeemed us, He literally took us out of the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son? He redeemed us. No less miraculous. In fact, more miraculous than what He did right here. We need to think about that. We need to understand that God in grace did something nobody else could do, including ourselves. God did it. And verse 29 in chapter 14 says, but the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw the great work of the Lord, which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared God and believed the Lord and His servant Moses. They provoked Him, but then finally they got the picture. He loves us. He saved us. But now I read to you a moment ago, it didn't take them long to forget it again. That's why He gave them the Passover. You know what they were to do once a year? They were to go through that process of the Passover again. They were to take a lamb. They were to shed its blood. They were to celebrate Passover. That's why we regularly take the Lord's Supper, to remind us that He, by His power, by the price of the blood of Christ, He redeemed us from the power of darkness. He delivered us. He made a show against all the principalities and power openly. And He said, every time you celebrate the Lord's Supper, you need to remember that. Every time you come together in my house, you need to remember that. Every day we ought to remind ourselves what God has done for us, or we'll forget, we'll misunderstand, and we'll sin, just like they did. Now look at the song. It'll take us just a few minutes to read through it. Will you be patient with me and read through it with me? It'll be worth your while. Look at chapter 15. Then, when? After God brought them through that. When they finally realized, there's a pillar between us and them. There's a favor between us and them. There is literally a difference between us and them. And the difference is Him. He actually stands between us and them. He's a light to us. He's a comfort to us. He's a shade in the day. But He's darkness and trouble to them because they hate Him. And they're against Him. They've hardened their heart against Him. And see, isn't that strange how people react to redemption? Do you know if the Egyptians had heeded God's voice and enjoined themselves to a lamb and put it on the doorpost and lintels of their house and went in their house and ate the lamb, the death angel would have passed over their house? But they wouldn't. They didn't believe. But now here we find the children of Israel rejoicing, not only in the Passover, but now they've walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake. And always when I see an expression like that, do our songs say anything? This song says something. They sang and spake, and saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for He hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath He thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and He has become my salvation. And did you know Isaiah repeats those words? I believe it's in Isaiah 12, those exact words. He's my strength and my song, and has become my salvation. I believe this is where he gets them, because they would sing the song of Moses. That was one of their songs. And he says, He is my God, and I will prepare Him a habitation, my father's God, and I will exalt Him. The Lord is a man of war. Do you know a lot of people don't realize that? They think all that God is love. But that's not all that God is. God is also a man of war. The Lord is His name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath He cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone. Now think about that. The world system doesn't like to hear a description of God like that. But that's our God. And keep in mind, He did that in benefit of His people, for their good and for His glory. Thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. And in the greatness of Thine excellency, Thou hast overthrown them that rose up against. What's that next word? God identifies with His people. You go after the people of God, you've gone after Him. Oh, it's worse than a mama hen. It's worse than a mama human. You go after God's people, you're in bad, bad places. He said at verse number 7, thou sendest forth thy wrath which consumed them as stubble. And with the blast of thy nostrils the waters were gathered together. The flood stood upright as an heap, and the depths were, you see that next word? Congealed in the heart of the sea. God can do that. And then he goes on to say, the enemy said, now watch them, I will pursue. See, when a hard heart begins to dominate somebody's thinking, I will takes over. Now, there's a lot of drums that are people beat on about man's will and man's quote-unquote free will. This is what will get you into. Our safe place is to surrender our will to Him. But here, the Egyptians hardened their heart and they said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. Look at this. My lust shall be satisfied upon them. They had in mind to do worse than Hamas did. Think about that. They were coming after him. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. But what did God do? Thou didst blow with thy wind, the sea covered them. They sank as lead in the mighty waters. Who is like unto thee, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like thee, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? Thou stretchedst out thy right hand, the earth swallowed them. Thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people which thou hast redeemed. Thou hast guided them in thy strength unto thy holy habitation. God was, I heard a brother put it this way, God brought them out that He might bring them in. His will, as I said already, wasn't for them to dwell in the wilderness. He was on the way to Canaan with them. That was His land. That's where He was taking them. And then He goes on to say, at verse number 14, the people shall hear and be afraid. And you need to watch some names you find here. The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold of the inhabitants of Palestina. You ever heard that name lately? Then the dukes of Edom shall be amazed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, shall take hold upon them. All the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall fall upon them. By the greatness of thine arm, they shall be as still as stone. And that's where that word astoned comes from. We dismiss it simply as astonished. But that old English word astoned means petrified, to become like stone. Till thy people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over which thou hast purchased. You remember the price of redemption and the act of redemption, both were true. Thou shalt bring them in and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever. For the horse of Pharaoh went in with his chariots and with his horsemen into the sea, and the Lord brought again the waters of the sea upon them. But the children of Israel went on dry land into the midst of the sea. And Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel, that's a tambourine, in her hand. And all the women went out after her with timbrels and dances. And Miriam answered them, Sing ye to the Lord, for He hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath He thrown into the sea. That's the song of Moses. And after their deliverance, Psalm 106 says they sang unto Him. But now keep in mind, the conclusion was Psalm 106 and verse 8. He saved them for His name's sake. And when God saved us, He saved us individually for His name's sake. And one day He's going to deliver the church all together in the translation at the resurrection of the just. He's going to deliver us together for His name's sake. Isn't that wonderful? So tonight, think on this. Let us not sin by misunderstanding God's grace and goodness. He has a favor unto His people. He loves His people. And He will glorify His name. And He will not share His glory, especially with any false gods. Amen. Let's join together. Let's stand. We'll join together in a word of prayer. Father, we do bless Your holy name. And I pray You would bless this word to our hearts. And Lord, just help us to apply it to our lives. And be mindful of You. And be respectful unto Your way and Your word. And allow ourselves to be benefited by Your grace and redemption. In Jesus' name,